everyone, and welcome to another video, me talking a long time about books and drama and other things that interest me. I am a postdoctoral scholar at a UK university. I also teach on a number of subjects, particularly the history of medicine and magic. And this is the first of a two-parter that's going to cover one of the most requested subjects I got in the comments when I first started doing real videos, which is ancient magic and my research on it. Now, the reason why it's a two-parter is because it's such a big subject. I need to cover both what's been done more recently in the modern world and the history of the evidence that we have, then go back and look at what people were actually doing and the evidence we have for that. I'm just going to say I am recording this in September. We're now in hoodie weather, so I have moved to Bring Me the Horizon hoodie. We have no water in the house at the time of editing, so I decided that I would record and then go out for a run because I just don't want you to have to deal with me in post-run mess if I can't actually take a shower. We haven't had water since yesterday. It's all a big mess. On the week that, because it's quiet and it's Freshers Week, I can take time to record a whole bunch of videos and then put them out week by week and do the thing on YouTube. Unfortunately, that has meant that I'm doing this whilst there's no water in the house and there's not much I could do about my face or my appearance or my hair or anything. So we are having a time of it right now. Okay, so big topic coming up this week. We're going to be dealing specifically with the magic of Greco-Roman Egypt. That is magical texts, scrolls, codices, which is a technical term that we use for ancient books rather than scrolls that you unroll. These are books that you open, fold out. From the last century BCE to the 6th century CE. So that is from Ptolemaic, very early Roman Egypt to the Christian period, the early Christian period. Now, these texts have been covered elsewhere on YouTube, most notably Esoterica. I am going to point you in the direction of his channel. I'll link that below. I recommend him especially because he does the videos all about the supernatural agents and the rituals themselves, their histories, and the association with different Western magical traditions. I tend to focus more on the material and cultural aspects of these texts. What I'm doing, particularly in this video, is talking about how we know what we know, rather than a description of what we know. This is very much a way of thinking about the evidence that we have, how it's come to us, and the difficulties that we have as modern scholars, and also because we're trying to understand the modern history, which is about 250 years long at this point. That's a really long chunk of time for scholars to be working on that, and that's not neutral. There's something that we need to understand about how translation works, about how these texts have been used, the nature that they were found in, that kind of information before we even get to what they can tell us. The other reason for doing this is the texts have now been updated. So I'm going to come on to that in a bit, but they all have been changed and adapted, and a new edition is coming out. This video is all about the modern scholarship around these texts rather than their ancient history and what they actually contain. This is about how we found out what we know. I spent all summer working on a catalogue essay to be published next year for a big exhibit that's going to be in Austin, Texas, if there still is an Austin, Texas by then, and here in Manchester. Hopefully the world won't have ended. I'm going to share the relationship between medicine and magic in Greco-Roman Egypt in another video. We're going to feature some snake charming, snake oil, and murdering people with snakes. The texts I'm going to be discussing are generally known as the Greek Magical Papyri, or the Papyri Graecae Magicae, or PGM for short. Sometimes they're also known as the PGMT, as in translation, which usually refers to this English translation, which is the book that you'll often see everywhere, that was originally published in 1986. So this book needs a full introduction in and of itself, and we're going to get into that later. But let's start with the story. At the end of March 2022, three things happened. I got diagnosed as autistic, I submitted my PhD thesis for examination, and I ran my second marathon. My thesis is about rituals involved in making magical objects. That's how you went about making like a magical ring or a curse tablet, something like that. Described in some of the texts in the book by Betts, or compiled by Betts. Before the classicists come for me, I did use the Greek editions, although mostly the older versions published in the Thesauri Linguae Graecae, which is known as the TLG. And yes, this whole video is going to be like this. The acronyms in classics are endless. So I'll try and put a full list of all of the acronyms I use in the description below, just so that you can see. I'll do a second one on my Patreon as well. The very next month after I submitted my thesis, a new version of some of the texts was published under a new title, the Greco-Egyptian Magical Formularies, known as the Gem F. Don't worry, I'm gonna do a comparison of the two in a bit, but for now, you only need to know about the general existential screaming that went on when I went into my Viva with all of my out-of-date Greek and references. And guess who my external examiner was? Yes, one of the editors of the new volume, one of the senior editors of the new volume, in fact. So hello, if you ever watch this, Sophia, and thank you for being so awesome and helpful as I was finishing off. To skip to the end of that story, the Viva went well, but I did get extra corrections because I needed to go back through the thesis to correct the Greek, update with the latest information, using a copy of the Gem F from Sophia, and I eventually graduated in 2023. All of this is a long-winded way of providing a bit of background for anyone coming in and going, oh, I recognise the PGM, what's going on now? We're going to have to start by going back to the late 18th century, like classic video essay stuff. First of all, there was the Big Bang. In the late 18th century, this was when France and Britain were busy plundering Egypt for its ancient artifacts, and many of the papyri we're going to be discussing were first discovered. If you really are coming in from Jump Street, papyrus was and is made from papyrus reed that grows along the Nile and was the fundamental paper of ancient Egypt. Normally, material like papyrus doesn't survive in the archaeological record very well at all, but because Egypt is a desert, we have far more textual evidence than anywhere that used non-durable material to write on, if they used writing at all. I have been asked in the past what there is left to do, because surely, God, haven't we translated everything by now? And the answer to that is no, we haven't. We have so many papyri from the whole period of, really ancient early dynastic Egypt through to the late antique period. They are just sitting around in cupboards and drawers and boxes in museums and special collections. I've gone through online catalogues for museums, and they will have whole boxes full of papyri that haven't been identified. During the first year of my PhD, I did a course on papyrology, and we went to the John Rylands and worked with papyri that had never been really investigated. My supervisor published a late antique Christian amulet in 2016 that she'd found in a plastic envelope in a drawer, which will tell you a hell of a lot about the situation with all of these papyri. From the late 18th century all the way through to the 20th, we saw a massive plundering of material from Egypt. If you're a Milo Rossi or a Stephen Milo fan, you may know that in modern archaeology, we need data on where things are found in order to help us understand the material in more depth. But this didn't happen, or it didn't happen evenly during this time. So it's partly because those processes weren't yet established, and because early on, at least, the focus wasn't on texts, but on objects. And then there were active markets where locals were selling material that they'd found because there was a huge demand for it from the Egyptomaniac Europeans. They were going out and independently collecting material because they could sell it, because they needed to survive, basically. To make matters even more complicated, when large papyri, so big scrolls, big codices, were sold or moved into European museums, they were often torn up and sent to different places. If we could just pause while I have a meltdown over basically the disrespect, the callous treatment of valuable cultural material that went on at this point in time, and the intense scholarship that has gone into trying to put these papyri back together again that is still ongoing. Now we have to add in another detail. The general attitude towards textual material was coloured by the preconceptions of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman culture by white Westerners of the period. There was a push to find early Christian material, especially Bible fragments, but there were also preconceptions about Roman culture that magical objects and texts came to challenge. The initial reaction to finding texts featuring people making curse tablets and magical amulets and getting demons to drag a crush to you for purposes of R and SA was not great, not because of the politics, the sexual politics involved, but because they didn't match ideas about rational Roman culture and then later Christian culture and how that evolved. Now, some of you who are more familiar with the PGM will know that there is a subset called the Theban Magical Library. I'm going to use these as a bit of a worked example of what happened to texts during the late 18th and to the late 19th centuries. These are a group of scrolls and codices. We have a combination of the earlier form of collected writing and the later form of collected writing that were owned by the Swedish diplomat and Egyptophile Jean d'Anastasi. He is known by a variety of names, but I'm going to work with Jean d'Anastasi here. To make matters really complicated, we don't even know which of all the collected magical texts we have now belong in that collection. The scholar Dosoo has done the most research and devoted most of his PhD thesis to an extensive re-examination of which texts should be considered part of the library. I'm going to link to some of his material down below. I believe in the appendix of his PhD thesis, and I think that is publicly available, you can see that he has actually presented a clear table of all the different scholars who have worked on texts that might be part of the Theban Magical Library. So you can go and look at that if you want to know more. The research on d'Anastasi's records suggests that the group of texts were found by a local Egyptian in a Theban tomb, hence the term Theban Library, although this alone is unclear, and the term library puts a lot of ideas into your head immediately about what was found and how it was found, and you have to keep challenging those ideas all the time because actually we don't know if they were actually found together or where or if or when they were deposited. Were they all deposited together in this supposed tomb by the same person, which might constitute a library? Or were they maybe deposited at different times by different people for different reasons? Are they part of a ritual deposition? Are they people hiding texts that might otherwise have been destroyed? Was it a known location for deposition? We know nothing about any of this, and the likelihood of our actually finding any of that information out is so tiny. It also creates a massive hole in terms of doing effective research. It makes it very difficult to understand how they were used and why they were used and why they were written. We are left with the texts and their physical structure themselves to kind of understand that. Now, the group of texts, the actual codexes and scrolls, covers about 500 years as well. So we have texts from the Roman imperial period, but we also have texts that date to much later. So we're talking about between about 1st century CE to 5th, 6th century CE, and they were written in multiple languages. The majority is in Greek, but there are significant portions written in Demotic and Coptic, which are scripts used for writing Egyptian. These terms are sometimes used to denote eras, which is inaccurate. They are scripts. They're used at different times, but they overlap, and it's important to recognize that they are scripts for writing Egyptian. They are not eras of time. We have a disparity in our understanding and education in Demotic and Coptic compared to Greek, which, as we're going to see, is only going to add to the problems around late 20th century scholarship and the understanding of these texts. The texts themselves, sort of as physical objects, were sold in two big collections during the first portion of the 19th century and the middle of the 19th century. As part of the sale, some of the bigger documents were cut up and sent to different places. So, for example, part of a text goes to London and is known by one name, and then another part of the text goes to Leiden and is known by a different name. And then for 100 years later, a scholar has to come along and reunite those two and figure out how they fit together. That creates an additional problem. In the 19th century, it's not that scholars weren't publishing articles and research on magical texts, but the real explosion of Western interests didn't happen until the end of the century and the beginning of the 20th, with Albrecht Dietrich. Dietrich began running courses on magical texts in the early 20th century. For example, you have Wunsch also produced texts on curse tablets. And then in the early 20th century, we have Karl Preissendans and the people he worked with began to put together a whole collection. They start to assemble the text together into one group on papyrus, intending to present it with Greek and translation into German. That would be what we call papyrology. That includes, for every text, the physical state of the papyrus itself, its size, damage, and anything we know about the handwriting and how it was written. This is vital information, especially when we lack find spot data, and we're going to come back to how important that is and what happens when that kind of material is excluded in a bit. Problem. But Preissendans' problem was much bigger and more fundamental than that, because in the early portion of the 20th century, people kept having wars. No, I'm absolutely serious here. So what became the original PGM was halted by both World War I and World War II, and a full set of volumes was actually never produced. You could probably do a whole deep dive on just the complicated history of all the scholars who came together to work on those texts in the first half of the 20th century, and the fact that they got halted multiple times, usually by the onset of wars and the difficulty in accessing funding at those times. Even though the full set was never completed, we did get some with additions and translations into German that was originally known as the PGM, and that really got the ball rolling for investigating both the material context and the content and history of the texts. It's like it's really busy with cars today. I have to apologise. Now, post-World War II, more and more work was done as broader attitudes towards traditional cultural practices shifted. The decline of white racist, old-fashioned attitudes towards non-Christian practices really opened the door more generally to a great deal more fantastic research into the anthropology and archaeology of how we as humans deal with life across the board, but also in a magical context in this specific period. Over the last decades of the 20th century, we saw the publication of 2 volumes called the Supplementum Magicum, or S, which added new texts with translations into English, and we expanded our knowledge of the magical material that was available. Alongside this, more Western interest was gathering in Demotic and Coptic magical texts, especially Janet Johnson's work that's now being picked up by Corsi Dosoo and Jacco Dieleman especially. Once again, there was a concerted effort, this time under Hans-Dieter Betz, to produce a set of volumes that would gather this material together, this time in English. Now, there is a conversation to be had around the modern language or languages used to translate ancient material to make it more accessible to a lay or, a professional audience. This goes alongside another conversation about how English has come to dominate scholarship in the sciences more generally. That's something that I teach on normally with my first years. Classicists come from many backgrounds, but the early work was done extensively in French and German. If you do classics, you generally are expected to do at least Latin, but as Greek was the lingua franca of Roman Egypt, you also need Greek for this. I wish I had known that when I started my master's, because I didn't know I was going to end up doing this, and I spent a year doing Latin when I could have been doing Greek. Greek is the language of magic at the time. In order to fully engage with the scholarship, you need German for some specialist areas and French for others. So, for example, much of the material on the Medical School of Alexandria is in French. It was done by Marie-Hélène Margan. So I am so glad that I did French A-level, for example. Now, the result of the work by Betts's team was this 1986 version, which is what people outside the specialism have generally turned to when they want to investigate Greco-Roman magic. Very often, if I know someone who is interested in magic, they will go, oh yes, I've seen that volume elsewhere. It's called the PGM, the GMP, the PGMT, or the GMPT. Various names exist. You'll notice that the title says it also includes the demotic material, kind of as a side thing. And great, but also not great, because we're going to get into why that's a bit of a problem, but I will highlight the issues with that as we go into this. Now, another problem arises because we have to think about what scholars do when they start putting together something like this. They have to make a lot of decisions. What are they going to include? What doesn't get included? What are the parameters of the collection as a whole? What order are we going to publish the material in? These are not neutral questions. Neither is the question of how we define magic in the first place. And that is a whole set of videos in and of itself, and has a whole set of scholarly volumes devoted to arguing over how we define magic. We also have to consider the attitude of the people doing the translating and their ideas and prejudices about the material they're covering. It's much more subtle than it was in the 19th century, but if you look at the Betts edition, because it's including English translations from much earlier in the century, you will often see them talking about ignorance or ignorant writers, or this is, just judgment of the practices themselves. Translators are not neutral. I am not neutral. I do my best to be reflexive and thoughtful about my practice, but that is an ongoing process, and it is something that you have to learn alongside the language itself. We also, and this goes back to the issue of language, lack information about the physical structure of the texts. That obscures what people can learn from a volume like this, because it's easy for a reader to think, firstly, that this is a single corpus that was found in one place, that the handbooks were written by a single individual or owner, or that each handbook was written by a single person, and that the issues of language aren't important. The Betts volume includes a lot, but it doesn't have all the information about the physical state of the papyri. Not only that, but the ordering system prioritised the larger texts and those that were found first, so it obscures accurate dating information, and it makes it quite difficult to actually use the volume if you want to get full details of it. So this is essentially my answer to the question, but why haven't we translated everything? We haven't translated everything, and we have to be cautious, because translators working on texts from other cultures must interrogate their own prejudices about those cultures as they are working, or they risk imposing their own ideas about how the world and society works onto them. The prioritization of Greek over Demotic obscures the fact that texts like PGM 12, which is now known as GEMF 15, was originally written in multiple languages and by multiple scribes. Without information on the physical structure of the scroll, it's not possible to fully interrogate who wrote or commissioned these texts. And finally, one point that's been drawn out by all the recent scholarship is that there is a tendency to lapse the scribe, writer, origin, author, and user of the scrolls and codices into one person, when in fact they may have been commissioned by one or more people, written by multiple scribes over an extended period of time, as in the case of GEMF 15, PGM 12, and draw on other physical documents that have since been lost. Another problem around these kind of editions is they obscure the larger contexts of the texts that's essential to understanding them and who wrote and used them. So PGM 22A is a set of very short magico-medical procedures that have something of a focus around women's health issues. If you look at them in the Betts edition, that's all you know. However, these 6 procedures are part of a notebook called P. Philemon, which also contains an official letter, some army notes, and some potentially fictitious legal cases and police reports. It's a fascinating document in and of itself. You can't really know how the magical material fits into the broader social and cultural picture. The one possible interpretation, especially recently, is that this may have been owned by somebody who happened to make notes for treatments for female members of his family, for example. That tells us so much more than just magic and what magic was at the time. That is about how people cared for each other, the healthcare issues and how they affected relationship dynamics. If this is a man who is collecting recipes for female household members, it's really important for understanding gender dynamics within the family and what that looked like, when women were unwell and what men might do for them. That's really important information. We don't know the extent to which the rituals and practices as they are described in the text were actually performed by the owners of these books. And this is a subject of some debate and uncertainty, but it seems from the latest research that while Gem F15 may actually have been used as a guide for performance, the later dated texts like PGM4 and Gem F57 were not. So that's something that I'm going to get into in another video. Okay, now we come to the latest editions. A new project has been running for over a decade called the Transmission of Magical Knowledge Project, based somewhat out of the University of Chicago, but with scholars working on texts all over the world. This is an ongoing process, although this may now be impacted by the situation in the USA and the significant loss of funding, the federal government's intervention at the university, and those sort of associated issues. A few weeks ago, the University of Chicago announced that it was closing classics, and this may affect whether the project can continue because the editors are based there and a lot of the organisation has been focused there. Now, let's get into the differences with this new edition, the Gem F. The first is the title. Calling it the Greco or Greek-Egyptian Magical Formularies emphasises the multicultural aspects of the texts more than setting up the Greek aspect and having the Demotic as kind of a sub-genre. It helps to remove the sense that Demotic and Coptic sections are somehow less important or inferior in some way. The texts are collected in date order and are clearly expressed as such throughout the volume. In Betts, you had to go back to the beginning and look up the physical volume in its list to see its date and then find the original publication or the online edition to get any physical information about the text itself. All that has been compiled into the Gem F versions alongside both the original language and the English translation. The editors have been very clear with this version that they are dealing with formularies, by which they mean handbooks containing instructions for doing magical things rather than any magical things themselves. So Betts and early editions also included some amulets and other texts, and those are now being dealt with separately by scholars like Joseph DeSanzo, who's been publishing catalogues of Iatro magical amulets, which have come out in the last 15 to 20 years. Okay, this version also incorporates a thorough background into the physical state of the texts. That's both in terms of what we know about how they were first composed, as well as their modern history. As much as they can, the editors include and find condition data, as well as work around the handwriting that's been used and trying to connect scholars and trying to connect scribes, because some of them appear to have been written by the same scribe. This is particularly important for longer handbooks that appear to have been commissioned and then put together by multiple scribes. So back to Gem F15, PGM 12, for anyone who's keeping up. That is structured in this really complicated way. So we have the Greek in one portion, and then at 180 degrees we have demotic sections, and there appears to have been a section left. So one scribe was writing in one language, and then they left a space for some demotic, and then they carried on in Greek. And then at other times you have it sort of turned on the recto, on the verso, so they're written in unusual ways. We can also see a relationship that at least one of the scribes who wrote the text of Gem F15 also worked on Gem F16, which is PGM 14. It is so confusing. The relationship between the two formularies is clearly more complex than we initially thought. That's something that's obscured in earlier editions, but it's now clearer and possible to see how these are put together. So this is why it took 6 months for me to update my thesis prior to the final submission. Alongside the new Gem F itself, we have 2 new volumes of research. There was one published in 2022 that went alongside the actual volume of the texts, and then there's another volume that was published just last year in 2024 in honour of Chris Faraone. I apologise if I'm messing up your name, sir. Who has written so much on magical practice from this period, so much in fact that my Zotero is packed with his work, and I still haven't read everything he's done. The work that's being done now has added so much to our knowledge of what was actually done with these texts at the time they were created and used. Because this is quite a long video, I'm going to come back and do a second video about what we know about those texts and the people who created them and what they were potentially used for and why. I'm going to do that as a second part so that we have a clear sort of sense of what's going on, because this is going to end up being a really long video otherwise. So that's also going to cover some of the work I've been doing myself around how the senses become involved in reading and the imagination, and the Roman literary circles who may have been using these texts. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop. I'm going to suggest that if you have any more questions, or you'd like me to do a deep dive on any more aspects of these texts, especially the scholarly struggle over the Theban Library or the evolution of magical amulets, I am totally up for that. I just spent this whole summer talking about that, writing about it. So I'll put up a bibliography over on Patreon and in the description below, all the websites and other videos I know about on the PGM as it was. I'll also recommend that you check out Esoterica if you can possibly support him, because he lost his teaching role over the summer, and he's a fascinating scholar and he's doing so much hard work, and he has been embroiled in the chaos that's unfolding in the States at the moment. So I really want to highlight his work and what he's been doing. And if you are able to send him some support and some love, then I would really appreciate that. Otherwise, do all of the things. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next week, which will be in a little bit of time for me, and I hope I get water by then.